In this video presentation, we'll be talking about Photoshop's brush options. Now, there are some new innovations that Photoshop CC 2018 has added, and the brush tools are really a big step ahead of where they used to be. Now, if you've done any Photoshop painting, you know that you can do quite a bit, and it's a very powerful program. Well, now with some of the new brushes that they've installed, it's a little bit easier to get directly into digital painting. So let's take a look at some of the brush options and tools that you have in Photoshop. First thing I'm going to do is change from my essentials to painting. And that'll give me some better places to start. So I've got brushes here, I've got my navigator here, and I've got some brush options over here. These are the settings. I'm actually just going to move that real quick right there because I like those next to each other. So let's start off with some basic brushes. What you'll notice is that Photoshop actually has folders for their brushes. Now it used to be it was just everything on this big palette and there was no way of organizing it. So this is really a nice step. You have a way of organizing. So the brushes that you start with in Photoshop are just this: general brushes, dry media, wet media, and special effects. And you can see that each of these has about 6 in it. There's not a ton of brushes, but you can actually get more. And you can go down to get more brushes. And if you open this up, you actually can download a mega pack from Adobe itself, which is pretty cool. And I've done that. I don't have them here, but you can explore those, and it really gives you a ton of brushes that you can explore. You can try just ink, watercolor, different kinds of effects. But for this presentation, I'm just going to do these basic brushes and just look at some of the ways that you can use them. Now, your general brushes, these are round, hard. They change in pressure and size. This changes in opacity, and they are very simple variations of your basic brush tool. So let's look at just a soft, round brush. And let's do some kind of nice little purple. One very handy tool that you should be aware of is that your bracket key will increase or decrease the size of your brush. So by pressing the left bracket, it makes it smaller. Press the right bracket, it becomes larger. And I'm using a Wacom tablet. I just want to have some of that nice control. And you can see that basically this is a soft brush. It has very soft edges. It's kind of feathers around the sides. If you use a hard brush, hard edges, right? You can see how that works. And you can actually change that yourself. So if you want to change the hardness to something in the middle, you can do that. And this is another place where you can access your brushes right up here in the options bar. You can change the size here as well. That usually doesn't work super well for me because I'd rather be able to change it on the fly, which is why I think the bracket key is a really, really useful way of approaching that. Okay, so those are some of your basic brushes. You can see opacity is going to change based on pen pressure. So if you don't have a Wacom tablet, if you're just using a mouse, you're not going to be able to use this. You can see if I press really light, it has a very soft approach, and as I start to press harder, it gets more firm and more opaque. And that's basically what that changes there. You also have these where you can do pressure size. So if I press very light to hard, it makes it thicker or thinner. Okay. It's worthwhile to explore some of these dry media brushes. They actually create a really nice effect. This looks quite a bit like a pencil. Draws quite nicely. This acts like an HB pencil. So again, you have a lot of really nice options. Tools that you can play with that just come as a default in Photoshop. And of course you can always find more. So just by exploring what Photoshop has given you, you can do quite a bit right there. Okay, so those are some of the very basic brush tools. Let me point you in the direction of another tool that you'll find very useful. And this is called the mixer brush. You can see it right over here. And basically what it does is it acts a little bit more like an actual wet brush. You can blend colors together. There are some different presets that are worth exploring, and you can affect the presets yourself. Now, without really knowing what those do, sometimes it's easier to approach just the presets that it gives you. But just to give you a hint, if you're going to play with most of these, flow is probably the one you're going to play with the most because that is basically the amount of color or pigment that's in there. So if you drop that flow down, it's going to be really subtle. There's not much of that color that's coming through. If I want to change it, you can do a little bit of that. Let's see if I increase that flow. You see more of that orange show up as it blends in with there. And you get some of these where you can play with it, where it's very wet and very blendy. And this is kind of nice because you can get much better color variation than you would just, simply using the opacity and flow filters that you would have naturally. Now those are up here. These are really worth playing with. In your opacity, if you change that, you can see that it naturally just knocks that opacity down. Let's put it real low so you can see what that's like. And as you add color, it builds up that opacity. So every time you pick up your pen or stylus or unclick your mouse and you start again, it's going to add another layer of that color onto it. You can also play with flow. Flow has a little bit more to do with the texture and how the pixels underneath are affecting each other. And usually what I like to do is kind of keep opacity up in the middle range, and then flow I play with a little bit more than I play with the opacity. And this is nice because I can actually get some good variations out of it. Another good tool to keep in mind is the eyedropper tool. If you have not used the eyedropper tool, basically it picks up a color. So if you say, oh, I like this weird color that it mixed over here, I want to use that, it automatically will put that into your foreground color. Let's press B to get back to my brush tool, and what's handy is if I press Option, it'll automatically just make the eyedropper tool, and then as soon as I let go of Option, it goes back to the brush tool. So if I like this color and I want to start painting that in there, I can do that right there. So the eyedropper tool really does come in handy. It can give you some of those subtle colors, so if you're mixing and blending, you can pick up some of those colors and create these little transitions and get some better color out of your work. Now let's talk about the brush settings. So the brush settings is this other panel, and this is how you can modify your brushes. So let me just start with something simple. It's just this round one. And your brush tip shape, you can actually choose that here. So if I want a different tip shape, I can use, let's say, this one. And then each of these, as you check them, will create different effects. So let's say I want to do shape dynamics. The size jitter basically means, a kind of randomness brought into the brush. So if I really push that jitter, it's going to make the brush shape change, and it'll do it in a semi-random way. And that can be nice to add some various texture into your work, but what you probably want to do is actually have control over it. Again, this is if you're working with a Wacom tablet. You want to put this at pen pressure, and basically that just makes it so that if you press light, it's a small brush, and as you press hard, it becomes thicker again. So control with the Wacom tablet is really, really nice. This controls the size. If you want it to be, if you don't want the brush to ever get too small, you can move that minimum diameter up. And this preview shows you what's happening, that minimum, that's as small as it can get. It's not going to get any smaller than that. As you press harder, it'll get to about this level, and then tapering off again to that size. So, creates these different nice variations in there. Okay, scattering, let's put that on. Scattering, basically what that does is it'll take that brush tip and it'll, again, add this kind of variety into it. So it pushes it out, and it means it's kind of putting this randomized application around it. It's almost like you're dabbing, right? You can imagine the scatter is something like paint dabs. So if you wanted to create something that has more of like a painterly impressionist look, then you might want to increase the scattering effect to get some of that. So that's actually kind of nice. Creates this nice kind of foggy texture, still very painterly and interesting. So you can get a nice paintbrush effect with that. Let's take that off. Now texture, let's look at texture. Texture is a way that you can actually incorporate more texture into this. And the natural one it's set with is just nothing right here. These are the textures it starts with, and these all suck. But if you click on this little cog, you can actually load a whole bunch of textures. And let's say I want to do just something a little bit more artistic. I'm going to start with artistic surfaces. I'm just going to replace them because all of these are terrible. And this gives me some nice textures to start with. And you can, if you hover over it, it'll tell you what it is after about a second or two. This is dark coarse weave. So let's do this dark coarse weave. Now I'm looking down here at this brush preview to get a sense of that texture and what it's going to do. And it's not really doing much right now, but I can improve that by increasing contrast or brightness. And so sometimes if I play with it, usually I'll see it along the edges here. Scale is just the scale that it is in here, so that isn't always going to help you. And finally, if you're still not really seeing too much, you can play with this mode. And this is going by height. Let's try hard mix. Increase the depth. There we go. So now I'm really seeing some of that. And the hard mix is basically telling it the dark and light to act as the contrast, to act as your texture. So I can decrease the contrast or increase it. I like that it adds a little bit of grays into it. Let's decrease the brightness so I can really push the texture so we can really see what's happening here. And there you can see that texture is really, really coming across. Now that might be pushing it a bit far, but again, there may be applications where you want that much intensity of texture. If I want to just make it a little more subtle, again, I can play with these sliders until I get something that's a little bit more subtle, and that looks nice. You can see a little hint of that texture without it really overwhelming the composition. And as I press lightly, I can actually make that texture come across a little bit more. So this is really nice to play with. You can even add in your own textures, but as you saw, you can really explore quite a bit of textures that it comes with. It's just usually the ones that you see immediately are kind of worthless. Okay, those are really the key ones that you probably want to play with. Alright, so I've cleared my screen and I want to show you one other thing that you can do with these brushes, and this is the color dynamics. So color dynamics is going to be probably slightly less useful, but you might want to know what it does from time to time. So I've changed the settings and I have this foreground background jitter moved all the way up, and basically again jitter is this kind of randomness, which means that it's applying both of these colors that I've selected, and it'll apply them in various ways and kind of makes this interesting variation of color that we've got in here. Okay, so it's applying per tip, which means that within each stroke you're going to see some of this variation of color. You can also add some of that variation with hue jitter, and I'm going to do just a different brush shape so we can kind of see that. And here you can really see that hue jitter. Okay, so each of these is varying the hue, so you can see some are kind of getting more orange and more purple, more green, and the more I have of that color dynamic, the more variety of color is going to show in there. So you can see it really adds a lot of variety if you push that all the way up. For the most part, again, if you probably don't want to push that too far, like a little bit of hue jitter will be nice if you want to get some color variation, but you probably don't want to overdo that. I'm going to increase this opacity and increase the flow all the way, just so we can see that really clearly. And there's that color jitter. And again, a lot of this is because of this. Let's take that off and we can see the hue jitter a little bit more. Now again, that's kind of hard to see because of the intensity. So let's make something a little less saturated, and you can see that hue jumping around a little bit there. Saturation, again, same idea. It's going to just vary up how intense the saturation is. And then brightness, again, same idea. It's going to make some areas darker or lighter. So if you want to add little bits of variation into your color, you can do that. So if you're seeing all of these color variations and you're not digging it, you can change it through the spacing. Now this is actually as tight of a spacing as I can get, so I can't really do much more than that. But actually if I spread the spacing out, it becomes a little less obnoxious. So you can get some of that color variation there that way. And notice if I put this spacing all the way up, it really spreads out those colors. So again, if you want to create something like an impressionistic kind of look, this is how you can do that. For the most part, you probably want to keep that spacing down here in this range. And the color dynamics, you probably don't want to have too much of that. A little bit can go a long way. And so just a little bit of foreground and background variation can be kind of nice in here, because it basically starts to bring a little bit of those colors together. So if you want to get some color variation, there's a nice way that you can do it. So what's nice is that you can actually use some of these settings for other tools. So this eraser, I can put on some of this texture, and when I erase, I actually can see some of that texture showing up. So if I want to increase some of the texture, I can use that. I can use the eraser tool. I can apply it with dodge and burn, saturation, smudge. And so these brush settings can be used in other places. And so you might want to explore that, play around with some of the texture and the tools that you can get here in Photoshop.